When sacrifice turns into a barrier, love is forced to face its hardest test. Diep had always believed that loving James meant enduring, giving, and standing silently behind him. But as sacrifices piled up and distance grew between their hearts, she began to wonder, can love remain strong when it starts to hurt? In the quiet moments of doubt, Diep must decide whether her love for James is powerful enough to cross the very walls it helped build. There are mornings when love feels like warmth, like sunlight slipping through thin curtains, gentle and forgiving. And then there are mornings when love feels heavy, like a coat worn too long, pressing against the shoulders until breathing becomes a conscious act. Diep woke up on one of those mornings, the kind where silence spoke louder than words. Outside, the city was already awake. Motorbikes hummed in the distance, vendors called out familiar names of fruits and bread, life moving forward without waiting for anyone's doubts. Inside the small apartment, everything felt paused. Diep stood by the window, fingers wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold, watching the steam disappear. She wondered when she had last allowed herself to feel tired. James was still asleep in the next room. His phone, resting on the table, vibrated once, then again. Messages from work, from a world that demanded more from him each day. Diep glanced at it but didn't touch it. Somewhere along the way, she had learned that loving James also meant protecting him from burdens, even if it meant carrying them alone. She had chosen sacrifice quietly, no dramatic declarations. No one asked her to give things up. She simply did. Her own plans were postponed, her worries folded neatly into the corners of her heart. She told herself it was temporary, that love required patience, that strong women endured. But endurance, she was beginning to realize, could slowly become a wall. James believed sacrifice was proof of love. He worked longer hours, pushed himself harder, convinced that building a secure future was the greatest gift he could offer. What he didn't see were the invisible spaces growing between them, the unspoken words, the questions Diep swallowed before they reached her lips. That morning, as she prepared breakfast, Diep moved with practiced calm. The sound of sizzling oil, the rhythm of daily routine, these were comforts, but also disguises. If love was meant to bring people closer, why did she sometimes feel like she was standing on the other side of a widening river? She looked at the empty chair across the table and imagined the future she once dreamed of, simple, shared, honest. Now, everything felt carefully balanced, like a fragile structure that might collapse if she asked for too much. When James finally stirred, calling her name softly, Diep answered with a smile she had perfected over time. But beneath it lingered a quiet question, one she dared not speak aloud yet. When sacrifice becomes a barrier instead of a bridge, will love still be strong enough to cross it? And perhaps more frightening, how long could a heart remain silent before it began to ache beyond repair?
Some days do not break suddenly. They stretch, slow, ordinary, almost harmless, until you realize, too late, that something inside you has quietly shifted. That was how the distance between Diep and James began to grow, not with arguments, but with pauses. The day unfolded like any other. Morning turned into afternoon, and the apartment filled with the small sounds of life, clinking dishes, the hum of a fan, footsteps moving from room to room. James spoke about meetings, deadlines, and opportunities that sounded impressive but felt strangely hollow. Diep listened, nodding at the right moments, offering encouragement she truly believed in. Yet each word she spoke felt like it traveled farther to reach him. She had once imagined love as constant conversation, two hearts walking side by side. Now it felt more like walking the same road, but on opposite sides of the street, close enough to see each other, too far to touch. James was present, yet distant, devoted, yet distracted. In the late afternoon, Diep went to the market. The familiar chaos greeted her, vendors shouting prices, children running between stalls, the smell of fresh vegetables and warm bread. These ordinary scenes comforted her. They reminded her of a simpler rhythm, a life where effort was visible and rewards were immediate. You worked, you earned, you ate together. No hidden costs, no unspoken sacrifices.
On her way home, she passed couples walking hand in hand, arguing lightly over what to cook for dinner. Even their small disagreements felt alive, honest. Diep wondered when she and James had stopped arguing altogether. Silence, she realized, could be more dangerous than conflict. That evening, James came home late. He kissed her forehead absent-mindedly, apologized with tired eyes, and promised things would slow down after this phase. Diep smiled again, soft, understanding, practiced. She had heard those words before. Phases had a way of becoming habits. As they ate dinner, the space between them felt heavier than the table itself. Diep wanted to tell him that she was proud, that she was tired, that she missed him even while sitting beside him. But the words tangled inside her chest. What if her honesty became another burden he had no room to carry? When James reached for his phone mid-conversation, Diep felt something quietly settle in her heart. Not anger, not sadness, but a fragile awareness. Love, when stretched too thin, does not shatter loudly. It fades in whispers. That night, as they lay facing opposite directions, Diep stared at the ceiling and asked herself a question that refused to leave. If love is built on understanding, how long can it survive when feelings remain unspoken and distance grows in the silence between them?
There are moments in life when silence no longer feels gentle. It feels heavy, like air before a storm. Part 3 begins in one of those moments, when Diep realized that love, if left unattended, could slowly turn into a quiet endurance rather than a shared joy. That morning, rain fell without urgency, tapping softly against the windows as if testing whether anyone was listening. James had already left for work, moving through the house with careful steps, trying not to wake her. He thought he was protecting her rest. Diep, however, had been awake the entire time, counting each sound as it faded into absence. She spent the day tending to small tasks, washing clothes, preparing meals, answering messages she no longer felt excited to reply to. Life continued in its usual rhythm, yet everything felt slightly off, like a familiar song played in the wrong key. Each action reminded her of the choices she had made quietly, willingly, without ever asking how much they would cost her. In the afternoon, she met an old friend at a roadside cafe. They spoke about ordinary things: children, rising prices, tired parents, dreams postponed. When her friend asked gently, "And you? Are you happy?" Diep hesitated. Happiness suddenly felt like a complicated question, one that could not be answered with a simple smile.
She realized then that sacrifice had slowly become her language of love. She had learned to give space, to wait, to stay strong so James could move forward without looking back. Yet strength, when never acknowledged, begins to feel invisible. That evening, James returned earlier than usual. He noticed the quiet in her eyes before she spoke a single word. They sat together, the room dim, the air thick with everything they had avoided saying. Diep finally broke the silence, not with accusation, but with honesty. She spoke of loneliness that existed even in togetherness, of days that passed without being truly shared, of love that was patient, but tired. Her voice trembled, not from anger, but from fear. Fear that if she kept silent any longer, she would lose herself completely. James listened, truly listened, perhaps for the first time in a long while. He saw then that her sacrifices were not small gestures, but pieces of herself given quietly, day after day. Success had demanded his attention, but love had been asking for his presence. As the rain outside grew heavier, something shifted between them. Not everything was fixed, not all wounds healed instantly. But in that fragile conversation, a truth emerged. Love cannot survive on sacrifice alone. Sometimes it needs courage, the courage to speak, to listen, and to choose each other again, even when the path forward feels uncertain. And in that uncertain space, Diep wondered, would James finally hear the weight of what she had been carrying all along? Some mornings arrive quietly, carrying no promises, only questions. Part 4 opens with such a morning, when the rain had finally stopped, leaving the world washed clean, as if giving Diep and James a chance to begin again. Sunlight slipped through the curtains, hesitant but warm. James woke before Diep this time. For the first time in a long while, he did not rush to check his phone or plan the day ahead. Instead, he watched her sleep and noticed the exhaustion hidden beneath her calm expression. It struck him then how often love had been waiting for him, while he had been busy running past it. He made breakfast, simple, imperfect, but sincere. When Diep entered the kitchen, surprised by the unfamiliar sight, silence filled the room again. Yet this silence felt different. It was no longer heavy. It was expectant. James spoke first. His voice lacked grand promises, but it carried truth. He admitted how fear had shaped his sacrifices. Fear of failure, fear of becoming weak, fear of dragging the people he loved into his burdens. He believed that enduring alone was strength. He now understood it had built walls instead. Diep listened, her heart wavering between relief and caution. She had learned not to hope too quickly. Still, hearing him speak her language, vulnerability, felt like standing at the edge of something new.
They talked slowly, carefully, like two people relearning how to walk together. James did not ask her to sacrifice anymore. Instead, he asked her to walk beside him, to share the weight rather than carry it in silence. It was a small shift in words, yet a powerful one. Later that day, they stepped outside together. The streets were alive with ordinary scenes, vendors calling out, children laughing, couples arguing and making up. Life, imperfect and honest, unfolded around them. Diep realized that love was not meant to be proven through suffering. It was meant to be lived through presence. As they walked, James reached for her hand, not out of habit, but intention. Diep did not pull away. She felt something soften within her, something long guarded. Love, she realized, does not disappear when tested. It changes shape, asking new questions. Sacrifice had once been the bridge between them. Now, understanding began to replace it. And though the future remained uncertain, one thing became clear. When love chooses honesty over endurance, it does not weaken. It finally learns how to breathe. In that shared step forward, Diep knew her love was still strong. This time, it was no longer alone.